The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today. It's right at the top of the hour here. We'll give it about a minute, let a couple stragglers come in. Just a couple housekeeping items. Please put your questions into the question chat, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. If we don't answer them live today, we'll get back to you via email in the next day or two. Also, we'll be sending out a recording of the webinar itself as well as the slides, and so don't feel you have to take copious notes as we go through. Everything will be available after the fact. All right, so let's get started. Of course, thanks for taking some time today out of your day to spend with me. I really appreciate it. I often talk about more technical topics like framework design and tools, but the reality is that when test automation efforts don't turn out the way we had hoped, the culprit typically has very little to do with the tool or the framework. And when I do talk more about test automation from an organizational and process perspective, I seem to get asked the same questions over and over again, and they relate to how can practitioners communicate to their management about what has to be done to lay a foundation for successful automation. So that's what the focus of today's webinar is. So maybe cut through the need for the practitioners to come to management and talk to IT leaders about how they can do their part to create an environment that allows their teams to be successful. So before we get started, a little bit about myself. I'm CTO of Utopia Solutions. We're a QA and testing focused service provider. Personally, I've been involved in QA and testing for a little over 25 years now, and most of that time focused on implementing test automation. Certainly my thoughts on automation have evolved, but over that time I've developed a passion about helping folks implement automation the right way. And that's what we're going to talk about a bit today. I've included my contact info here. If you have any follow-on questions or ever looking for a sounding board on QA testing or certainly test automation topics, please feel free to reach out. This is stuff I love talking about. All right, we're going to touch on three main topics today. We'll start with a brief discussion of the current state of test automation, and spoiler alert, it's not very good. Then we'll spend a bit of time looking at how we got to where we are. And finally, we'll spend most of the time discussing what we can do as IT leaders to set our teams up for success. So first, I want to start with a quick poll question. So I should launch the poll there, and that is, what do you see as the biggest obstacle to effective test automation in your organization? You can, if your biggest obstacle is other, please select other, and then in the question window, just put other dash and maybe what that topic is. So we'll give it maybe 10-15 more seconds. Let everyone get their vote in. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and then we'll look at those results a few slides down the road. So test automation isn't something that's shiny and new, right? It's been part of IT initiatives for a long time now. But let's get on the same page and take a look at why we're likely interested in the benefits of automation in the first place, especially as IT leaders. First, we want to reduce cycle times. And if we're a shop that has some frequency to releases, we don't want to spend half our development cycle performing regression testing or other types of testing that lend themselves to automation for that matter. But specifically for regression testing, we can reduce the time required to execute those tests each release. And if we do that, now we've taken the burden off our test analysts to perform higher value tasks like exploratory testing or usability testing. And this gives us the capability to increase our test coverage and, of course, further reduce risk without increasing our testing costs or our cycle times. And finally, if you're a DevOps shop, your delivery pipeline is going to require fast, accurate, actionable feedback. We can't be waiting for hours, days, weeks to understand if we've introduced issues into the latest build. And similarly, we can't be spending hours chasing down false positives, right? So our automation needs to be accurate. And finally, for actual issues that we detect, we need to have feedback that helps us get to that root cause as quickly as possible. So suffice it to say, if you don't have effective test automation, you likely cannot be a high-performing DevOps shop. And in fact, according to the 2018 State of DevOps report from DORA, high-performing DevOps have automated 80% more testing activities than even medium performers. So there's a significant correlation between effective test automation and high-performing DevOps organizations. So let's look at the current state of test automation through some, I think, very eye-opening statistics. First, according to last year's World Quality Report, the level of test automation in general is below 20%. And the context of that statement is that all the potential testing activities that could be automated, less than 20% are. Now, while that's pretty disappointing, considering the vast amount of resources expended, it also points to huge opportunities for us as IT leaders. The same report also showed that while the level of automation has been on an upward trend, the value that we realize from those efforts has remained largely unchanged. So even as we pour more and more resources into test automation, we're really not getting anything more to show for it. Next, this year's World Quality Report showed that only 16% of functional test cases were automated, and similar percentages of automation existed across other types of testing as well. So again, another pointer to a large opportunity. And finally, while I couldn't find a reputable published source for this statistic, it's pretty well accepted in the industry and also has remained largely unchanged for a long time. And that's that 80% of test automation implementations fail. So 8 out of 10 of us on this webinar are going to fail in our next test automation endeavor. Yeah, but even if we don't agree with the exact number, I think we can all agree that the general state of test automation is not ideal, especially given all the hype and the talk and the messages we hear from vendors and service providers in terms of what, those wonderful stories of the benefits that everyone is realizing. So we talked about failure. Let's look what a typical failure cycle looks like. I think it's eye-opening, especially if you're not in the trenches and not a practitioner. It's important for us to take a look. The upfront analysis typically is focused on tool selection or other technical aspects, like what type of framework we're going to build, and ignore the foundational components that are required for success. And we'll talk about those in a bit. They then jump right into creating a framework or automating existing test cases, and often verbatim from existing manual tests. And in other words, we start applying a solution before we understand the context of the problem. And because manual test cases are often designed to be executed via the UI, this leads directly to a very UI-centric automated test suite. Because that type of test automation is the most unreliable form of automation, typically leads to flaky tests and a large maintenance burden. We end up abandoning the effort. Now, if that all happened relatively quickly and there was some learning, that's certainly not all bad. But what typically happens is that the tool and or the resources take the brunt of the blame. And then somewhere down the road, again, when someone gets that automation itch but forgets what happened, the process starts all over again. And probably some of us on this webinar have the same experience that I have, in that the same organizations have gone down that path 2, 3, in some cases 4 times without any different results. And most importantly, without changing the approach. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we can do as IT leaders to get our teams on a different path today. So how do we get here? Certainly, perpetuation of automation myths and expectations can be at least partially to blame. Right? We could devote an entire webinar to automation myths. I'm not going to do that, but I do want to discuss a few that are particularly offensive. First is that automation is a tool. In fact, just in a meeting not too long ago where a manager was asked about the status of an automation effort, and the answer was, well, we'll be done as soon as we get the remaining test cases in the tool. And there are a lot of things wrong with that answer, but the most important is the expectation that putting test cases in a tool magically results in successful automation. That's analogous to saying if we install Visual Studio, somehow our application is complete. If I said that to a room of developers, I'd be thrown out before I finish the sentence. Next is the thinking that we can automate 100% of our tests, or any specific percentage for that matter. We have the typical reasons, right? Not all test cases should be automated, et cetera. However, I think the biggest problem is that it sets the primary focus of automation on automating the execution of test cases. And these test cases are typically at the UI level again. We just talked about that, and written to be executed manually. And this leads to automating them verbatim, which again ends up with a very maintenance-intensive UI-centric test suite that's probably going to collapse under its own weight at some point. Another important one is the thought that automation is automating the entire testing process. Software testing involves knowledge, experience, critical thinking, designing experiments. Very clearly, test automation is not automating the testing. So all this noise distracts us from the real factors that are required for effective test automation. And as we'll see, the organizational process and environment components that we'll talk about. We also have tool vendors to blame. And I realize that I'm generalizing here a bit, and certainly not here to demonize all test tool vendors. But over the years, their messaging has led a lot of us to develop silver bullet syndrome when it comes to test automation. Tools are certainly necessary, right? We have to enable our automation process. But a lot of the messaging has created the myth that test automation is the tool, as we just talked about. And that takes the focus off the hard work that we need to do to get into that state of readiness for test automation success. And this is no different than really any other process, right? There's certainly a lot of tooling required to implement DevOps, but anyone that has gone through that transformation certainly can attest to the hard work that had to be done to change the underlying culture so those DevOps tools can be effective. Similarly, we need to look beyond the claims that codeless solutions bring automation to everyone. And by the way, codeless tools aren't necessarily bad, but they, like all other tools, aren't going to address those foundational factors that we're going to talk about. Finally, I see business cases for test automation that are based on ROI calculators provided by tool vendors or some outside organization. And not surprisingly, they are almost always skewed to show a positive ROI and typically leaving out a lot of the factors that go into successful automation. Any ROI or cost benefit analysis is hard for complex implementations like this. And it makes it very hard to create a one size fits all model. So please beware and beware of tool demos as well, right? Especially if you don't have the past experience with successful automation. It's very easy to be caught up in the features and lose track of what's really important, which is exactly what we're going to talk about. Okay, I think we all get it, right? Test automation efforts often fail to produce the desirable results that we are looking for. So what can we as IT leaders do about it? And I believe these are the most important things we can do to set our teams up for success. So we're going to discuss the importance of setting realistic expectations, understanding how ready our organization is to implement test automation, identifying test automation opportunities that are specific to your context, your organization. Developing a strategy and a roadmap that takes into account, again, your specific state of readiness and opportunities. And finally, constantly learning and improving the effort. So let's first talk about setting realistic expectations for the organization. We talked earlier about one very popular myth being that test automation is a tool. We really need to drive home the understanding that applying automation to testing activities is a process. Yes, we'll have something that we can call a tool that will enable that process, but the tool is just that, an enabler. And I often see organizations starting their test automation journey with a tool selection activity. Yes, you'll need a tool, but that's really step 5 or 6 in terms of the process you need to go through to set yourself up for success. Next, we need to understand that automation is more than just executing test steps. And as IT leaders, we really need to stop asking for some percentage of test cases to be automated as our primary goal or measurement. Not only is that an arbitrary number, it's, again, sets the primary focus of automation on automating the execution of test cases, and that can be a very narrow-minded view. Instead, ask your teams what testing-related activities they perform that can benefit from automation. And of course, executing test cases will be part of that, but there's likely other activity that's time-consuming and tedious and can benefit from automation, things like maybe data creation and setup. Finally, and I'm not going to get into a discussion about the test automation pyramid, but suffice to say that if all your test automation is at the UI level, you're probably on a bad path. And while there's definitely a place for UI level test automation, those automated tests are the slowest and most unreliable. So if all our testing is through the UI, especially for tests that target functionality below the UI, we're likely going to end up with a very maintenance intensive test suite and that we'll have a hard time sustaining. So the next thing we need to do is understand if our organization is ready to implement test automation. As we just discussed, automation is a process, not a tool. And that process needs a solid foundation to operate on. So we need to assess our readiness in these areas: organization, process, and environment and data. So let's take a look at the key questions we need to answer in each of these areas. From an organization perspective, does the leadership have realistic understanding of test automation? We just discussed a bit about what that looked like. Is there a demonstrable support for test automation from leadership, right? So if you have clear visibility into automation metrics, that's a good sign. Similarly, we want to see that the organization has allocated the right people and an appropriate budget to those efforts. Next, does the team have the right skills to succeed? From my experience, it's more important to have an innovative person with strong problem-solving skills than someone that has used a specific tool for the past 5 years over and over and over the same way. Similarly, I'm likely to have more success with someone that has more generally applied automation concepts in the past than, again, applying the same approach or the same tool over and over again. Finally, does the organization support an innovative and learning culture, right? If the culture is just get it done, you're likely going to end up with something that isn't sustainable due to a lot of the reasons we just talked about, but primarily because you're going to be a kind of a constant accumulation of technical debt as you're just plowing ahead to reach whatever that arbitrary line in the sand was. Next, from a process perspective, we need to make sure that your automation efforts are aligned with your SDLC. What's worked in a waterfall environment certainly will fall on its face in a DevOps shop. It's also very important that automation is integrated with the SDLC, and the most important aspect of that is the ability to understand how pending development work is going to impact your existing automation efforts. And the more proactive you can be in identifying that impact, the better. From an environment perspective, test automation requires stable test environments and data. And again, according to the World Quality Report, test environments and data continue to be the top challenge to effective test automation. And you really need to understand where you are from this perspective so you can address it in your strategy. This would be a good time to share the poll results. So a little bit different from the World Quality Report. We have only 25% test environment data, with the winner being lack of experience of test automation resources. Obviously, we have a smaller sample size, but definitely those two are the top of the list year after year. And I think as IT leaders, from a resource perspective, again, focusing on problem solving and innovation versus a 5 to 10 page resume of someone that's done the same thing over and over again for 10 years is a good way to get on the right path to successful automation. All right, moving on. Once we understand our readiness, we need to identify the opportunities that are specific to our organization. This may be obvious and trivial, but this is also where a lot of organizations begin to go down that bad path. It's where many teams pull out their hammer and only see opportunities that look like nails. And they start implementing that solution before they understand which problem is most important to solve. What's important here is that we expand our definition of test automation beyond just executing test cases and take a more broad and general approach. So you should encourage your teams to look at the testing related activities that can benefit from automation, right? Essentially take inventory of everything they do related to testing and then think about how automation in the more general sense can be applied to make it either more efficient or more effective, or hopefully both. Then they need to think about the best way to address those opportunities. And it's likely that some of them won't involve traditional test automation tools. So the team also needs to be encouraged to broaden their thinking on tools, and certainly beyond just thinking about the GUI automation tools that they've used forever. They need to look at those opportunities and understand that any tool that they can use or build to make testing more efficient or effective can be considered a test automation tool. Once you've identified the opportunities, you need to build your strategy. And it follows that a team, based on what we just talked about, may not have done what they need to do before, or it may be something new to them. And here's where, as IT leaders, we can really help out. We need to make it possible and safe for our teams to evolve their skills and apply the right solutions to the right problems. If the potential benefit from automation can be quantified, now it becomes a business problem. And as IT leaders, we have ways of solving business problems to get our teams what they need. So once we've identified our readiness, right, we can start to build the strategy. And I emphasize your strategy, right? The strategy has to be driven by your context, your specific opportunities and challenges, not just some canned list of best practices. So of course, the first step is to address any gaps that were identified in your readiness assessment. And again, test environment and data issues are typically going to be at the top of that list. Hopefully the next point is obvious, but you need to prioritize those opportunities that you identified. This is going to allow the team to get the highest value work done as soon as possible and build the momentum and support for addressing additional opportunities and get out of that cycle of falling into very maintenance intensive cycle and eventually abandoning the effort and then starting over again at some point. Your strategy also needs to include a roadmap. And from experience, some of the biggest test automation failures have come out of attempting the big bang approach, right, where a team goes off for weeks or months even and comes out with a finished, and I use air quotes, automated test suite. Your implementation really needs to be incremental. This is going to give you the opportunity to apply learnings and continually make sure that your test automation initiatives are aligned with what the rest of the organization is trying to accomplish. Finally, you need to make sure that you're measuring the effort. Again, drawing a line in the sand for number of test cases automated is probably not the place to start. Tracking your test coverage in various ways is fine, but it's not a straight line from some number of test cases directly to a test coverage metric. And there's a lot of room in there to really game the system. So typically you're looking for metrics more closely associated with the impact and the benefits provided by test automation. This could be the length of the feedback loop at different stages of your delivery pipeline. If you apply automation to other activities such as test data creation, you can measure the time saved, as well as the additional benefits of having available and stable test data. I talked a little about implementing automation iteratively. And one of the advantages of that approach is that it gives you more opportunities to look back and identify things that you could do better. Again, there seems to be a penchant to think of test automation implementations as a discrete project. But it's important to realize that test automation just isn't this fire and forget solution. It's a journey, to use a cliche. Independent of the details of the problem, we're going to find areas that we can improve our solutions over time, and we need to include time in as IT leaders for our teams to do that. Which brings us to the next point, right? We have to realize that we need the space and time in our organization to allow just that to happen. Even if we do everything up to this point correctly, over time, certainly things will change, and whatever our test automation looks like now will lose its value to the organization over time. Maybe we realize there's a better approach, or we need faster feedback, or our tests suddenly start failing. We have to be able to react to that, figure out a solution that gets us incrementally better. And certainly this is easier said than done, but there's a lot of evidence out in the world that shows there's significant advantages to allowing time for continuous improvement. And again, referring back to DevOps shops, high-performing DevOps teams, you'll find that regularly allocating and most importantly defending time for those improvement activities is a common trait. So, of course, as with all development efforts, we're going to accumulate technical debt, even if we do leave time for to improve. And that's just things associated with our day-to-day test automation activities. And so part of those improvement activities we just talked about should be focused on improving our daily work and removing the workarounds that we've inevitably put in place as we ran into issues. All right, before I get to some questions, I want to enforce some key takeaways of what we just discussed. First, again, we need to stop perpetuating the test automation myths and unrealistic expectations that are setting our teams up for failure from the start. Next, we need to understand our readiness from an organizational process and test environment and data perspective. Those attributes are going to inform the foundation of our test automation activities. And if we're not ready there, what we build on top of that isn't going to matter very much. Next, develop a strategy that's based on your specific state of readiness and your specific automation opportunities. Most importantly, encourage your team to think beyond just UI-centric test automation. Consider all the activities that they perform related to testing. And finally, create an environment where the team is not only encouraged, but has available time to innovate, continuously learn, and of course, pay down that technical debt that's going to accumulate in our day-to-day work. So we got a couple minutes left. I have pick out a couple questions, or at least one that it looks like we have a few different versions of. Before I do that, I'll pop up my my contact information. If there's any follow-on questions, that you can reach me there. If you're wondering in your organization how you can better understand your readiness and get a plan of attack, we do have a one-day on-site test automation assessment that folks have found very valuable to get them pointed in the right direction. And the link is up there for you. So first, there's a couple different variations of this question, but essentially it says test case quantity sounds like the best concrete metric to measure an automated testing effort. If quantity of test cases is not the right metric, can you give some examples of better metrics? So certainly test case quantity is a concrete metric, right? It can be measured relatively easily. And on the surface, I suppose, would seem to have the best correlation to measuring the implementation of test automation. But there, in my experience, there's a lot implied and assumed when we have test case quantity as our measuring stick, especially if that's our only measuring stick. First, it assumes that we have existing test cases and that they have both valid tests and also are fit for automation. Very often I see groups start with an existing set of regression test cases written to be executed manually. And with a number of test cases as a goal, that promotes automating those existing test cases verbatim, right? I'm trying to get that number as quickly as I can. So at the very minimum, right, you want to identify which tests are fit for automation, and also spend some time looking to see if they can be restructured in a way that makes automating them more efficient. Because remember, they were written to be executed manually, likely. Second, it implies that automating existing test cases is your highest priority test automation activity. And it may be, but again, with quantity of test cases as the goal, your teams aren't likely going to look at anything else. Finally, a lot of people go from this specific metric that I've seen to evaluating the ROI of automation by looking at the cost on a per test case basis. And in most test cases, you're not going to like that number because it wraps up all your costs, which are not all related to specific test cases, things like building a core framework and other activities. And it just gets a very high number, kind of an unsettling number. And you're again not looking at the benefits from automation. You're just looking at what physical assets were created from that effort. To identify in my opinion, so what are some examples of better metrics? And I think more relevant metrics, if you start looking at desired outcomes based on your automation opportunities. So if your goals are reducing the development lead time so you can release more frequently, then test cycle time, release frequency, and the quality related metrics, along with the business level metrics that would be affected by those more frequent releases, are a good place to start. Obviously, test automation isn't going to be the only contributor to these metrics. However, you can certainly observe incremental changes that can be attributed to those efforts. All right, we're a couple minutes over. Looks like we still have everyone on. There's another question, and it's likely a shorter answer that we had a few different versions of. And that is, what do you mean by executing tests as close to the code being tested as possible? So very simple. So let's say you're testing business logic in an API. I'm saying you should execute the test at the API layer rather than farther away from the UI. The example I like to use for this one is a tax calculation for an invoice. If you have a service that performs a tax calculation, you want to validate that service by making the appropriate API calls and validating the response. If you try to validate the response by looking at the amount on an invoice screen, there are lots of things that can go wrong there, right? Especially if the amount on the screen isn't what you expected. And if it isn't, right, the best case is that you have, if it is what you expected, the best case that you have is a UI level test that's slower, less reliable, and more prone to requiring maintenance than an API level test. Now, if the response doesn't match what you expected, this is where the trouble really starts, right? All you know is that the value doesn't match your expected result. And so now you got to start digging to find out why it doesn't match. And it could be because there's an issue with the API, but there also could be, a good handful of other issues that you'll have to spend time looking into, since you really don't know what happened between the API and that invoice screen. I think looks like people are starting to hop off. I do thank you again for joining me here for the past 30 minutes or so. Hope you found it informative. Again, if there's any follow-on questions or discussion topics, please feel free to reach out. For the questions I didn't get to, I will respond personally via email in the next 24 to 48 hours. So again, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.